Charlotte Sometimes by Penelope Farmer, Chapter 11. Night after night, Charlotte lay in bed with her eyes open to the dark, thinking up wild and yet wilder schemes for getting herself back to school by night to sleep in the bed with wheels. The trouble was that as Charlotte, she was not someone who did wild things except in extraordinary circumstances, and as Claire, she could not imagine herself doing anything wild at all, certainly nothing so wild as going out at night. But she reckoned in this without Emily. That week, Emily became interested in the night sky. Each evening when their light was out, she craned her head from the window to see, complaining the first night because the moon was so small. She was even more disappointed the next 4 nights because the clouds were too thick for her to see the moon at all. On Friday night, a clear night, she said with satisfaction, "Just as I thought, the moon's coming up now, and it's going to be full. We'll be able to see quite easily." "Be able to see what?" asked Charlotte, unsuspecting, which she realized a moment afterward was stupid of her. "See to get to the school, of course. I thought tonight you could try to sleep in that bed." Charlotte was horrified. "Emily," she said sternly. "Emily, I told you it wouldn't be any use doing that. Suppose we are caught. We'd probably be expelled, and that wouldn't help at all." "Well, I'm going anyway." "But whatever's the point of your going alone?" Charlotte did not add that Emily could not get Claire back by herself because it seemed too unkind. Emily said, "I know I can't get Claire back by going, but I'm going anyway. If I'm caught, I'll get in trouble for nothing. If you come, at least there's some point to it." Charlotte saw the logic in this, so gave in at last reluctantly, but whether the decision arose from her greater adventurousness as Charlotte, or from her special sense of responsibility as Claire toward Emily, she never knew. "How are we going to get in if we do get to the school?" "I've opened the window in the day girls' cloakroom every day this week. At least I only turned the catch so the window still looks quite shut. Don't you remember I've kept forgetting things and going back when everyone else is gone?" Emily woke Charlotte sometime before midnight. They dressed themselves hurriedly in the dark and then crept downstairs to the kitchen. The opening of the basement door would be less likely to be heard, they thought, than an opening of the front door 1 stair flight higher. Charlotte was in terror of being caught, horrified by every creak the stairs made, appalled by all the kitchen sounds, clinkings, rustlings, the sudden urgent crackle of the kitchen stove, the ponderous metal ticking of the clock. The 2 clock weights hung in shadow, but the pendulum on its narrow rod swung past them from light to light, from one moonlit square to another, reflecting silver and its not unusual warm brass wink. The door opposite had been fastened by all imaginable means, with a bar to be lifted off, a chain to be unlocked, bolts at the top and bottom to be heaved back with difficulty, and finally a key to be turned. The noise this made drowned all the other sounds that had seemed so noisy earlier, was so loud that it worried even Emily, but Charlotte by now was numbed enough by fear to be almost beyond worrying. She pelted blindly up the basement steps, across the gravel, and out at last into the freedom of the road. It was cold tonight, a little frosty. Both were glad of their thick school coats. Charlotte wore gloves too, but Emily flung hers down unthinkingly the night before and had been unable to find them in the dark. When she complained that her hands were cold, Charlotte handed over her own gloves and huddled her hands in her pockets. The streets looked strange, lightless save for the moon, which gave them no glimmer or shine, but a texture more a kind of silver fuzz on everything, eliminating roughness and curves. Even the blackest shadows seemed muffled, their blackness of all velvet, rather than polish or paint. As they went farther from the house, still meeting no one, Charlotte's guilty fear started to fade away, and she felt excited, almost exhilarated by this empty world. These streets, and ones that they walked along each morning and afternoon, and yet quite different, had their own kind of separate breathing life that the country always has, but that towns do not by day. Even her footsteps did not seem to belong to her. The night seized and transformed them, just as it had transformed the greenhouses they passed, from useful places for growing things into cold night palaces. Once they thought they heard footsteps and dived behind some convenient trees, but the footsteps, if that was what they were, had died away at once, and they emerged, giggling at each other, with the nicest sense of conspiracy. Charlotte, as much as Emily, not long afterwards. Though much too soon for Charlotte, they reached the spiked school gates. They were firmly closed. The moonlight had drained all the color left in the faded Union Jacks. Behind them, to one side of the drive, the lodge stood, but its lodge-keeper they knew to be quite old and deaf, which tonight was just as well. Charlotte began to climb first, her nervousness returning. The gates, though high, were well ornamented, the loops and curves offering footholds for smallish feet. She put both their coats to pad the topmost spikes, and used for a final step the wooden board that announced the name of the school. From there she lowered herself cautiously, but Emily scrambled like a monkey after her, clinging with hands and feet till barely halfway down, then launching out to jump the rest. "Bother," she said from the ground. "Bother, I forgot the coats," and climbed up again to fetch them. She was still poised, trying to free one from the spikes, when there were more footsteps, this time unmistakably drawing nearer. Emily watched. Emily wrenched at the coats, tearing one a little, the sound quite clear in the frosty air, and then threw herself violently from the gate. As she picked herself up, Charlotte grabbed the coats, and they both ran furiously over the grass into the deeper shadow of the wall. Behind them, the flag still shivered, and the gate still shook from Emily's jump. It was two policewomen who came, walking rhythmically. They shook the gates almost before looking at them, so disguising any movement that might have remained for them to see. They peered through, but did not seem to notice Charlotte and Emily crouched against the wall, shivering and breathing heavily. When they had shaken the gates again, still harder, they passed on, their footsteps fading evenly. It was minutes before the two dared to move, dared to drag on their coats and set off surreptitiously over the grass. "Gosh," said Emily. "Gosh, we'd have been for it if they'd seen us." Charlotte's elation had suddenly disappeared. She was terrified again, wishing only that she was safe in bed. Every upright tree and bush held in its shadow a Miss Bite, a Nurse Gregory, or a Miss Wilkin, ready to jump out at them. Each cabbage in the vegetable bed, each leafy potato plant had its own shadow and watchfulness. She began to hope that someone would have discovered the window latch undone and shut it properly again. They would have to go back home then, to Flintlock Lodge, without more dangerous adventures. But Emily whispered, as if thought-reading, "If it isn't open, I think we should break it to get in. It would be silly to come all this way for nothing." "It's all very well for you," Charlotte allowed herself to think, though not to say. "It's not you, Emily, that's got to climb in and do the really dangerous part." The window was in the corner of an arcade and not overlooked by any bedroom. It was round, like a large porthole, and stood just out of reach of Charlotte's hands, so that she had to lift Emily awkwardly to test whether it remained unlatched, her arms feeling as though they would break. "It's all right," said Emily at long last. "It's all right. It's open. We won't have to break in after all." It was her turn to heave Charlotte now. Charlotte's feet scrabbled against the wall, her hands clutched at the slippery window ledge, her arms somehow pulled her high enough for her to get first one elbow, then the other across the sill, and so to haul herself through at last, grunting furiously and kicking up her feet behind. Then awkwardly she turned and knelt on the drain board by the cloakroom sink to look down at Emily. "Well done, Claire. Oh, well done," she was saying in her whisper that was louder than most people's shouts. Charlotte felt triumphant too, for all her fright, for all her burning of her scraped knees and elbows and the dent of her stomach, made by the sharpened window frame. "Hey, Claire," Emily was hissing now. "Hey, Claire, what if you do get into that bed again? You won't come back, but I can't wait here till morning." If this difficulty had crossed Charlotte's mind, it had not really entered it, or concerned it, for she never believed that they would get even as far as this. "Well, if I don't come for ages and ages, well, you'd better just go home," she whispered lamely, wondering what Claire would do when and if she woke, for she would have no idea at all where she ought to go to find Emily. Outside the cloakroom, with its carbolic reek, the corridors were dark and stale-smelling, quenching any triumph that was left in Charlotte. Moonlight edged in a little here and there, and she had to fumble along the wall, farther and farther away from Emily and safety. The stairs creaked and were still more dangerous. At the top of them the corridor was lit. The light, though dim, bright-seeming now to Charlotte's unaccustomed eyes. The walls were drab with their shiny brown paint, and bare without any place to hide, the dents made by the doorways too shallow to give cover. Day girls were forbidden to go upstairs. Charlotte had not been there at all since she and Emily left for Flintlock Lodge, and so she saw the corridor at first, quite newly, strangely, her eyes taking time to fit it to the usual pattern. She stood for a long time, numbed by the closeness and nostalgia of what she saw, feeling both so near to her proper self and existence and yet so far away. Then, when she did remember what she had come to do, it seemed so dangerous that she considered turning back at once, telling Emily that there was someone in the bed already who refused to move, without venturing to find out if this was so. But she did not think this honorable, did not think that she could lie convincingly. Besides, the door of the room was tantalizingly near, just a few yards down the corridor and across. There was no sound except the tiny sound she made herself, breathing and gripping the stair rail. No one came. She took a deeper breath, made a kind of tiptoed dive for the door, pushed it open, fell inside, closing the door behind her silently, in her haste, more by luck than skill. The blackout covered the window. The room was like a cave. One light burned there, a night light on the very bed that she had come to find, making within the larger cave darkness a little cave of light. It looked the reverse of moonlight, warm and mobile, rounding things, making shadows move. In all the other beds, forms lay still asleep. But in that bed, the one with the little wheels, someone propped up on pillows stirred and coughed and moaned. Charlotte took this in, then footsteps sounded. They were like echoes of her own feet, surprisingly delayed, but grew quickly louder and more purposeful. Click, 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 they went, slap, 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 daytime footsteps seemingly, not muted in respect for the night, pausing at last outside this very door. The handle turned smartly, something rattled against glass. In came a tray, someone carrying it. She looked as always sharp-edged, as if night was as normal as day to her, sounded as usual like a sailing boat in a small wind, shoes creaking, stiff apron flapping, liquid slapping in small glass. To add to the effect, it was Nurse Gregory, and that is the end of chapter 11.